Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Bringing you the news and views and the untold side of the Palestinian struggle for freedom from a Palestinian perspective. Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered. It's May Day. We're going to talk about May Day and its implications to Australia, but also labour rights particular to Palestine and the way the Israelis treat the Palestinians. Just very quickly, as most of you would know, but in case you don't, the history of Labour Day in Australia spans over a century. It's an important date that remembers those who struggled and succeeded to ensure decent and fair working conditions happened in Australia. During the mid to late 1800s, the working day was long and arduous, and many employees worked in excess of 12 hours a day, sometimes 6 or 7 days a week. There was a big push in the late 1800s for workers to work an 8-hour day, and that labour movement was successful in getting an 8-hour day, in large part to a meeting that was held in Melbourne in 1890, and on May the 1st that year, a local newspaper made reference to it as May Day. And so that's a bit of a history of May Day. What we're going to do is pivot from May Day and its rights for workers all over the world to talk about workers' rights within Palestine. And we're joined by Noura, who's a Palestinian, a 48 Pal, an Israeli citizen, if you will. But before I introduce Noura to you, I'm going to first read some notes from the International Labour Organization. They released a report late last year and early this year to talk about the Palestinian labour market and just how grim it really is. Unemployment's rampant, protection has failed, its employee rights are stifled by occupation. The Palestinian economy can't meet the needs nor aspirations of the Palestinian people. Women and youth are often worst off. In no other country is women's unemployment as high as it is in Palestine. No other part of the Palestinian land is as distressed as Gaza. After 14 years of paralysing blockade, the enclave survives on humanitarian life support. Jobs are scarce and sporadic. Hope is lost for the most part. If workers could leave, many probably would. However, Gaza would thrive if it was permitted to. Many workers are skilled and entrepreneurial. The problem of Gaza requires first and foremost a lifting of the inhumane blockade. In Gaza, the labour market and employment situation is particularly bleak. Unemployment continues to climb and has now reached 45%. About 2/3 of the economically active women and youth are looking for a job. Most alarmingly, almost all young women who participate in the labour market in Gaza, 9 out of 10, are unemployed. Key basic indicators illustrate the extent of the continued misery. Over half of the individuals in Gaza are classified as poor and almost 3/4 as food insecure. GDP per capita has steadily declined and reached US $1,417. This is 60% of what it was before the blockade started 14 years ago. Work in Israel continues to be coveted by many Palestinians in the West Bank. The number of Palestinians who are working for the Israeli authorities has increased. According to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, around 135,000 Palestinians work in Israel and the settlements. Most cross over to Israel on a daily basis. The majority work in construction. Some 26,000 workers are estimated to be undocumented. Both groups often experience precarious conditions and deficits in protection. Work by Palestinians in Israel has been associated with significant deficits. These include the long wait and crowded conditions at the crossings, an abusive permit regime in which brokers and employers have undue power over the worker, a lack of comprehensive social protection with wages paid only in cash, accompanied by frequently inaccurate documentation, and only 40% receive wage slips, and often inadequate working conditions at construction sites with significantly higher fatality and accident results as a result of insufficient observance and enforcement of safety and health regulations. The Palestinian unemployment rate is nearly 5 times the global average and more than 3 times the average in the Arab states. The Palestinian labour market has the second highest unemployment rate in the world and the highest unemployment rate amongst women. Now, we know so many very industrious and entrepreneurial Palestinian people, and we know that those figures are singly because of the Zionist occupation of Palestine. Join me in welcoming Noura, who's going to talk to us now about her experience, and we'll talk about all those conditions. Welcome, Noura.
Thank you, Nasser. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this wonderful introduction that you just provided.
Noura, you were born and grew up and are a citizen of the State of Israel.
Yes.
Take us through, firstly, your experience of workers' rights and your understanding of workers' rights within 48, firstly.
Sure. As you know, Palestinians in 48 constitute 20% of the populations in Israel. However, they make almost 50% of the people living under poverty line in Israel. And that is a very stark statistic if you think about how, as a minority, they make almost 50% of people under poverty line. So that speaks volume, and that does indicate that there is a systemic and structural issue when it comes to Israel's economic policies, which is an extension of Israel's policies as settler colonial state towards Palestinians in 1948 in Israel, but also everywhere else in the world.
Now, Noura, you're a 48 pal. What about the East Jerusalem Palestinians?
So Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they don't have the citizenship status. That means that they are permanent residents under the Israeli law. And that also means that they don't get to enjoy or benefit from clear status when it comes to employment and laws and regulation, when it comes to integration, for instance, in the labor force, or benefits that they may get, for instance, superannuation and other things.
Next is the West Bank Palestinian.
Yes, so that is true. Palestinians in the West Bank, they have Palestinian identity cards. So Israel does not recognize their existence. And we are talking about almost 3 million in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza. So that's 5 million Palestinians who currently are, existent within the geographical area which Israel exercises full and complete effective control, but they're not recognized as people who exist in terms of political entity. So what does that mean? It means that the laws of labor that Israel has created for Israelis don't apply for Palestinians, including the ones who work in Israel. And for instance, those who work in settlements as well, those who work in the Jordan Valley, the Israeli laws don't apply to them. So you would have a situation where there's, let's say, a Palestinian working for an Israeli employer, but the laws of Israel don't apply to them. However, the laws, for instance, of Jordan do apply to them. So you have a situation where, again, two people are subjected to two different standards when it comes to laws and regulations of employment.
So in fact, during the week, Human Rights Watch released a report, another NGO saying that Israel is an apartheid state. Thankfully, this time they did ask for sanctions and called upon governments to limit aid and start to identify individuals for prosecution and ask the ICC to do the same. Within the West Bank Palestinians, Noura, there's talk about those two systems. Let's talk a little bit about the permit system, because the permit system within the West Bank allows for West Bank Palestinians to work inside, inverted commas, Israel proper. Those permits, that permit system was supposed to be evolved since 2016. They were looking at reforms to it. Not much has happened. The International Labour Organization estimates that something like 15% of a Palestinian's wage from the West Bank is paid in fees so they can actually get a permit. So something like 2,500 shekels a month, which gives them the right to work inside Israel, where they don't get the same health insurance benefits, they don't get the same hourly rate of pay. They're still lined up at checkpoints trying to get through. The Palestinian economy is so depressed. People are forced to do this, to, almost, we're just one level above indentured slave.
Yes, so this is the cruelty, of occupation and settler colonialism again. And I think it's important that, when we talk about Palestinian workers and people who work under, let's say, the structure that Israel has created, be it in the West Bank or in 1948, it's important that we take a wider look at economic policies of the state of Israel. And, from the get-go, it's clear that policy is about control. It's about control and exploitation. And now, as we see, for instance, today, the current policy is an absolute closure, where all Palestinian workers need permit in order to go and seek employment in Israel. The thing is that this was not always the case, because if we were to look back a little bit at when Israel first seized control in 1967 over the West Bank and Gaza, and that the whole area was classified as a military closed area. It was then decided that they would allow Palestinians from the territories to come and to basically work in the territories, because as they controlled it, they decided that they will not impose further restrictions on movement, so that people can still work, because it's also cheap labor for Israel as well. So Israel is still benefiting from that policy back then. Now, as a few years later, they decided to introduce very minor restrictions. So, for instance, they said we would allow them to be in Israel from 5 a.m. to 1 a.m. And for many years, that was the only restrictions that they basically introduced. However, if we were to look at where there was a clear pivot in that policy, we would have to address the Oslo Agreement and the Paris Protocol, in which basically Paris Protocol was an instrument in which that was hoping to regulate the economic relations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Through that agreement or those protocols, of course, there was some economic powers that were transferred to the Palestinian Authority, for instance, like taxation and establishment of a monetary authority, employment of civil service servants. But it's important to keep in mind and to highlight that Israel retained key powers that would enable Israel to control over the whole Palestinian economy. For instance, control of taxation, control over import and export, and the third one, which is why we're talking here today, is control over workers and entry of workers to Israel. So freedom of movement, again, of workers. That was another area which Israel managed to take control over through the Paris Protocol. Now, and I think the second Intifada, Israel started to basically exercise these powers in a very clear manner. So not just like it's a policy that was just signed and in Paris or through Oslo. It became something that is tangible throughout checkpoints and walls, but also the system of permits, really restrictive system of permits that they introduced.
So, Noura, that matrix of control that we know that is apartheid. Before the siege in Gaza, Gazans, they enjoyed the same level of freedom perhaps as the West Bankers. The reality is, since the siege, though, they've had no access to the outside world, no access to that economy that strangulates them. The fact of the matter, and as you said, post-Oslo Paris protocols, the Israeli government controls everything from entry and exit, not just of goods, but also of humans, the birth registry, the death registry, etc., radio spectrums, and what have you. What about what that's doing to the people and the economy? What do you hear and see what's happening to the people of Gaza? How are they coping with that?
Yeah, so this policy, policy of control, deliberately targets and weakens any perspective of an independent Palestinian economy, is something that has always been the core of the Israeli state. It's also underdevelopment of Palestinian economy. It's not just that they did not invest in Palestinian economy. It's deliberately targeting and weakening any Palestinian economy in order to progress, obviously, their political and economic interests, which is expansionist project.
Ongoing. I think Sarah Roy calls it not underdevelopment, Noura, but the de-development of Gaza.
That would be a more accurate, the de-development of Gaza. And look, this is something, again, it's something that all along throughout the whole process, Israel is benefiting. Yeah, Israel has profited from the exemption of custom duties on goods in the occupied territories in Israel. Obviously, taxes that Israel collected from Palestinians were not, did not go to any investments in the occupied territories, and a big part of them ended up in the Israeli treasury. For instance, the creation of captive market, so that they want to create a further dependency of Palestinians in the Israeli market, importation of some goods, as we see in Gaza. For instance, Gazans are allowed to import certain goods, but not others. So it's all up to the Israeli whimsical, so to speak, consideration that you can import shampoo, but you cannot import conditioner in Gaza. I mean, go figure. But the point is that the whole concept of captive market, so that it's a siege. It's a siege. So no one else is allowed economically deal or trade with the Palestinians unless it's done throughout Israeli channels, again, to eliminate any competition, but also creating obstacles for potential investors as well. And the other way that obviously Israel has benefited from this policy is the labor market. That, I mean, in the short run, Palestinians who work in Israel, they do benefit, and because, wages also in Palestine are almost 3 times lower compared to wages in Israel. But when we are looking at the bigger picture, the bigger winner here is still Israel, because these workers are underpaid. They're paid under the minimum wages. In terms of health and regulations, safety regulations, Israel doesn't have to worry about them. The workers, the employers, they don't have to worry about these kind of stuff. So it is still, by the end of the day, Israel is profiting massively from this entire policy of captive market.
Just on that, Noura, I mean, it's easy, and I've spoken about this many times, as a Palestinian living in Australia, living arguably the refugee's dream, in the best country in the world, perhaps, if not home. Is there a stigma attached to the Palestinians who actually work in Israel or in settlements? Or is it survival? It's just survival.
It's a tricky situation. Like this is the kind of what living under occupation means. By the end of the day, you end up doing things that are completely contradictory to your moral compass or your own national interests, for instance, because you don't have a choice. Because by the end of the day, this is an asymmetry, right? We live in an asymmetric, back home Palestinians live in an asymmetric dynamic where, as stateless people who don't really have institutions, and people who don't, even the Palestinian Authority is also under siege and under occupation, and it has, unless it works some kind of work with the Israeli authorities, like it can't exist. So the point here is that living under occupation is rough, it's cruel, and it gets you, and it throws you into places where you are doing things that you wish you didn't have to do, but you have to because, again, this whole situation was imposed on you by settler colonialism. It was imposed on you by occupation. And by the end of the day, these people who go and work in the settlements, they have mouths to feed, and they need to be the breadwinners, and they need to go back home and just provide for their families. And they do this knowing that they are, in a way, they're working in settlements. Like, how contradictory is this? But they also go through so many obstacles and so many difficulties so that they can have that right to work, to earn money. For instance, the whole experience, the horrifying and dehumanizing experience of having to go through the checkpoints twice a day, because they have to commute back and forth on the same day. That, most of them do that. Some of them end up staying for, inside Israel for a few days and then come back. But most of them, they do that kind of commute on a daily basis. And having to go through the whole, as you mentioned, and waking up at midnight so that they can because they know that they're going to be faced with long queues and some interrogation and abuse. But also some of them get shot at. They're trying to kind of enter Israel because not everyone has permits, but so many people need to work. So we have this situation created by the occupation.
I know it's been documented by many human rights organizations. The security forces, the Shin Bet and etc., leverage that permit system. If you talk, we'll get you a permit, help you get a job. If you have a permit, we're going to revoke the permit unless you do talk.
Yes, that is true. And they are very, so these group of people, the Palestinians who work inside Israel, but they don't have permits, so they're undocumented, and they call them like illegal shabachim, they call it, so illegal stayers or something. They are the most marginalized, because in case they are caught, there's no way for them to get any protection. So if they're caught and they're being abused, and there's been a lot of documented cases where young workers have been caught inside Israel. And sometimes it's even Jerusalem. They're caught in there without having any permits. So they were kidnapped by Israeli soldiers, and they were taken to some alley and beaten and abused. And, they stole their money, and they stripped them naked, and they left them there to bleed, and they just ran. So in these instances, the victim has no address to turn to and say, look, this has happened and I need some protection.
You were speaking before about settlement workers and being contrary to their national interests, and just the challenge of merely meeting survival. I'd imagine there'd be Palestinian workers working on settlements, illegal settlements, that might actually be their own ancestral lands.
Yes, that is true. That is the again this contradiction that they are being forced to work on their ancestral land and build houses that are not theirs and houses that they are not allowed to live in.
We should make a mention of the fact these settlements are Jewish only,
Yes, yes.
with settlement committees to make sure that you're of the right character.
Absolutely. And this is not just in the West Bank, by the way. So even inside Israel in 1948, these kibbutz or yeshuvs or Jewish-only communities, they have committees, cultural committees, that they would decide if anyone is fit, culturally fit to live in this place. And very often they ask questions. And this is a personal experience of a friend of mine as well. It was an experiment. They weren't going to really live there, but they tried, her and her husband, they said, you know what, let's try and see what happens. So they applied for a kibbutz and they went through the committee evaluation process. And then one of the questions they asked them was, oh, well, so we celebrate Independence Day here and we have barbecue. What do you do on Independence Day? Obviously referring to the Nakba. And this is, obviously they answered that we don't celebrate independence. This is a Nakba day for us. So we go to protests or marches. And obviously this was the question that, quote unquote, tipped the balance, not in their favor. So they ended up being rejected, obviously.
Of course. And another one of the questions I've heard they ask is, what year did you serve in the army?
Yeah, and that's true. And this is a question that they ask also sometimes when they're employing people inside Israel as well. And this is, again, one of the ways in which there's the discrimination and racism is prevalent inside Israel and it targets Palestinians, is that they ask you that question, where did you serve in the army? Or how many years did you serve in the army? And if or sometimes they are very clear. They say, we only take post-service employees.
So 1/5 of the country's citizenry are unavailable for employment here.
Exactly.
Noura, I want to highlight the differences. We talk about it being apartheid. Human Rights Watch now has, B'Tselem has also said so. I mean, the Palestinians have been saying for decades it's apartheid, but apparently it's becoming mainstream now because some white people said so. The birth of Israel was lauded around many, many supporters of May Day, many supporters of workers' rights because of the utopian concept of the kibbutz. Now, we know that it's a lie, and it's increasingly being exposed that socialist experiments was just a redwashing, another form of Zionist washing to legitimize the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the colonial state of Israel. Noura, let's do a simple comparison of a Jewish Israeli and compare them to a West Bank Palestinian and what rights differentiate between the two, but also if you can include a 48 PAL as well. So the three statuses and what they might enjoy from labor protection laws, etc., minimum pay.
Sure. So when we're comparing between Israeli workers and Palestinian workers in general, and yes, we do need to make that distinction because, for instance, Palestinians in the West Bank who do have permits to go inside Israel and work inside Israel, so they normally work in constructions or in agriculture or in services. So the comparisons start from there, as in like there's very limited areas in which they are allowed to integrate in the workforce. So you won't see a Palestinian from Ramallah, like a lawyer, working in an Israeli law firm. Very rarely that you would see that, because they also allow people to come based on their needs. Israelis don't want to do the construction workers, like they don't really want to do constructions. They don't want to work in all these hard, so to speak. So they need to find someone who does it, and they either bring people from overseas or Palestinians from the West Bank. But also Palestinians inside Israel as well. They mostly they are, if they're not doing construction work or agriculture, they are in very limited areas, and they have very limited opportunities to engage in the workforce. For instance, you're either the main thing that they can do is great in the education sector. Very, very little, maybe 2% of high-tech workers are Palestinians inside Israel. Again, the gap continues and extends, and it's not just throughout the recruitment process where they ask for, where did you serve in the army? But also by the end of the day, the wages, there's huge disparities in wages as well. So like an Arab citizen or Palestinian Israeli citizen would earn significantly less for doing the same job than a Jewish Israeli citizen.
Apartheid in the wages and conditions as well.
That is true.
It seems we can't escape that word, but thankfully the world is waking up to the apartheid that is Israel, and it won't be long before it's boycotted and divested from and sanctioned, and hopefully we get the same outcome as South Africa. But in fact, we want to go one step further than what happened in South Africa, and we need a complete decolonization from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free.
Absolutely, without a doubt, Nasser. And I do think it's just a matter of time, because all these structures, as we saw in South Africa, but also other parts of the world, are doomed to basically collapse, because there's a limit to how much abuse and how much violence and how much aggression people can enact on other people without having to suffer from consequences or being meaning impunity. So
thanks so much, Noura, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you on. That's Noura Mansour, Palestinian educator, writer, activist, and community organizer. Thanks again, Noura.
Thank you very much, Nasser.
And happy May Day to you.
Happy May Day to you too.
This week, Human Rights Watch released their report into Palestine, Israel, and they have now joined the consensus movement that Israel is an apartheid state. They've even asked the International Criminal Court to investigate Israeli officials for being implicated in the crimes against humanity of apartheid or persecution. And it's a significant shift from where they've been, and this is a New York-based group, and they've centered their approach on human rights and accountability rather than the usual peace process narrative, which has been prevailing for so long. What's interesting is they're using the sort of language we've been talking about for a long time. They're joining that consensus that the state is preferencing or privileging Jewish supremacy. The report also says that Israel has pursued an intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians throughout the territory it controls. In the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, the intent has been coupled with systematic oppression of Palestinians and inhuman acts committed against them. The combination of these elements, they say, amounts to the crime of apartheid. It also suggests that UN states should establish an international commission of inquiry to investigate systematic discrimination and repression based on group identity in both the Palestinian territories and within Israel proper. These are really strong words. We should remember that Palestinian rights groups such as Al-Haq have already called for fact-finding missions into the apartheid regime of Israel. Reality is the US has failed for decades to live up to its obligations with respect to the Palestinians, in that, in the first instance, it allowed for the state of Israel to be created on indigenous Palestinian land and has abandoned the Palestinians ever since. Hopefully this is a foreboding for what is to come. As we spoke last week with Professor George Basharat with the ICC, I'm looking forward to Israel's Hague moment, Israel's Nuremberg trial moment. I can't wait for war criminals like Netanyahu and his buddies to face personal sanctions along with the state of Israel. So really good news. Moving forward, it'll be a great advocacy tool for us, but we really need to remember for these organisations to centre Palestinian voices, to centre Palestinian lived experiences. We can tell everyone what's going on. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to share the podcast, tell your friends, and hope to see you at our Nakba rally on the 22nd. And happy May Day. We're coming into May when we commemorate Nakba, when Palestinians lost Palestine. Free Palestine Melbourne's organising a rally on the 22nd of May at 1 p.m. at the State Library, Victoria. So put that in your calendars from now. Saturday the 22nd of May at 1 p.m. Hope to see you there. Thanks for listening. Share the podcast, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.